A Week in the Woods. Day 6. Late Sunday afternoon. Mark turned on the Mac. Then he opened up the browser and clicked on the REI website, and he realized he had a problem. His problem was that he wanted everything, and thanks to his mom's credit card, he could actually afford everything. Well, not everything, but there were still way too many choices. Mark had to decide what he really needed. So he opened a new window in the browser, clicked on a search engine, and typed in camping essentials. On the second page of listings, he found a web page put together by a guy from Wyoming who taught outdoor survival classes. He called himself Mr. Survival. He had organized his list of essential gear by looking at the greatest dangers people usually face if they get lost in the wilderness. The first danger on his list was getting too cold or too hot. So he had a section of information about clothing layers and choosing the right socks and footwear. Mark felt proud that he'd already figured out those things on his own. Mr. Survival also recommended carrying a plastic space blanket. You could put the shiny side in to keep warm, or put the shiny side out to keep the sun off. It also shed rain or snow. Next on the danger list came thirst and hunger. He recommended carrying at least 2 water bottles and also having a way to purify more. Mr. Survival's personal favorite was a tiny bottle of liquid iodine drops. He wrote, "You can scoop water right out of a stream or even a puddle. Add a few drops of iodine, wait 10 minutes, and take a drink. It might taste bad, but you won't get sick from germs or parasites, and most importantly, you won't get weak from dehydration or die of thirst." About hunger, he said, "Even a day hiker should carry 5 or 6 energy bars and 2 or 3 regular candy bars. A candy bar doesn't weigh much, and it might just give you that jolt of energy you need to get yourself up out of the ravine you fell into." The list went on. Take at least 2 ways to make fire, plus a fire starter. Best emergency fire maker, a magnesium block, and a striker made from 3 inches of a hacksaw blade. Direct a shower of sparks onto some scrapings from the block. Best fire starter, cotton balls covered with petroleum jelly. 10 will stuff into 1 plastic film container. If you don't have this, use finely shredded birch bark, dry grass, lint from your socks, or a candy bar wrapper. Take a compass and know how to use it. Take a small waterproof flashlight or headlamp and extra batteries. Take a pocket knife. Take a loud whistle, like a lifeguard's whistle, to help others find you if you get lost or separated. Take a dozen cloth strip Band-Aids and a small roll of duct tape for cuts or foot blisters. Take a small magnifying glass for map reading or starting a fire. Take 2 zip seal plastic bags for carrying water. Take a roll of dental floss or other strong, light cord, at least 100 feet, and a strong sewing needle. After reading what Mr. Survival had to say, Mark felt ready to start shopping. He clicked back to the REI website and started filling his online shopping basket. First, he picked out a new sleeping bag. The one he'd been using had been to summer camp 3 times. It was plenty warm, but it weighed too much. The new bag Mark picked out was filled with goose down. It weighed less than 3 pounds and packed up into a thin, tight roll. The next essential item was a pack. Not a simple backpack, but a frame pack. Mark had used one at camp last summer. It was called a frame pack because it had a built-in frame of metal or fiberglass to keep it stiff and spread out the weight of a load in the best way possible. After reading the descriptions of about 10 different packs, Mark looked at a chart and picked the one that was best for a person of his height and weight. From about 20 different kinds of flashlights, he picked a mini mag light that used AA batteries. He also chose a headlamp, like a flashlight on a head strap. The one he picked had 3 different levels of brightness and would run from anywhere from 12 to 150 hours on 3 AAA batteries. The magnesium fire-starting bar seemed kind of silly to Mark. Why bother carrying that if you already have matches or a lighter? He flipped back to Mr. Survival's webpage and clicked on the link about fire making, and Mr. Survival made it simple. Matches go bad or get wet, even the waterproof kind. Lighters rust or break or leak. Some magnesium scrapings and a shower of sparks from a bit of a hacksaw blade will always work, no matter how long you've had them and no matter whether it's raining or snowing or 10 below zero. So Mark clicked on the magnesium fire block with the built-in striker bar and put it into his online shopping basket. Even though Mark knew he wouldn't be allowed to use it by himself, he picked up a little gas-powered cooking stove anyway, and then he found a good compass, a pair of lightweight binoculars, and 6 pairs some special moisture-wicking hiking socks, plus a dozen chocolate chip energy bars. He looked at the boots, but the Italian hiking boots he had gotten before camp last summer still fit perfectly, and they were all broken in, too. When Mark went to the page that showed the knives, he remembered what his mom had made him promise. She said no big knives or axes. But she hadn't said he couldn't get a smaller knife. After all, his dad had already given him a Swiss Army knife for Christmas 2 years ago, so Mark picked out a lightweight knife with a black plastic handle and a single blade that locked open. Definitely not a big knife. He could have kept finding great stuff all evening, but Mark felt like he'd better stop. He clicked on his shopping basket and then on the checkout box. The total came out to more than $1,100. Mark stared at the number. $1,100 was a lot of money. He started to look at the list of things he'd chosen, trying to figure out which ones to put back. Then Mark remembered the skis and boots and poles his dad had helped him pick out when they went to Aspen that time, plus the jacket and goggles and gloves. Mark had used those skis for less than a week, and now all that equipment was lying in a closet back in Scarsdale, too small to ever use again, and those things had cost his dad more than $900. So getting all this stuff for only $1,100? Suddenly that seemed like a bargain, and Mark knew he wouldn't be using these things for only a week or two either. He quickly filled in the shipping information, typed in his mom's credit card number, and clicked on the Buy Now button. Less than 10 seconds later, a confirmation screen appeared and promised that the purchased items would be delivered to his house by Federal Express on Tuesday afternoon. Mark printed a copy of the confirmation page, closed the browser, and shut down the computer. Then he went to the kitchen to get himself a snack. All that shopping had made him hungry. Chapter 13, Readiness. After the announcements and the Pledge of Allegiance on Monday morning, Mark was surprised when the principal's voice came crackling out of the speaker in his homeroom. Good morning, fifth graders. This is Mrs. Gibson. By this time next Monday, you will already be well on your way to Gray's Notch State Park. Mr. Maxwell tells me that 3 of you have not yet turned in your signed permission slips from your week in the woods. If you are one of those 3, please take care of this right away. You must turn in a signed slip, or you will not be allowed to get onto the bus. The buses will leave from the front of the school building at 7:30 next Monday morning. That means you all should be here by 7 o'clock at the very latest. Your information packet is very clear about all the details. Please read through the information with your parents again this week. And students, make sure that you don't bring too much with you. We have a problem with this every year. Each student may bring no more than 1 medium-sized suitcase, 1 book bag, and a sleeping bag. There is a very clear packing list, and if you follow it, you'll have just enough of everything. If you have any questions, ask any of your teachers, or, of course, you may ask Mr. Maxwell. Have a great week, everybody. The whole rest of the day was just as surprising to Mark. Everything was about the big trip. No school Mark had attended had ever focused on a single idea the way that Hardy Elementary School zeroed in on a week in the woods. In language arts class, Mrs. Bender taught a lesson about keeping a journal, and then each student made a small booklet to write in during the week away. We shall do our best to make our observations original, interesting, and accurate. In social studies, they learned about the Native Americans who had lived in the region, and on a special map, Mrs. Farr showed a hilltop at the park that was off limits to all hikers. Some Abenaki artifacts had been discovered there last year, and over the coming summer, there would be a formal archaeological survey of the area. Then Mrs. Farr gave each kid a folder with a topographic map of the park. She explained how to read the map and how to use the position of the sun or even where the moss was growing on a tree to figure out which way was north. She said, I want everyone to bring these folders with you to the park next week. On Tuesday and Wednesday afternoon, we'll be doing some trail finding and some orienteering, and I don't want any of you getting lost. In math class, Mrs. Leghorn had them do some problems about rate and distance. All right, class, she said, if you walk at 6 miles an hour and you hike for 3 hours and 20 minutes, my goodness, why anyone would want to go tramping around out in the cold for that long is beyond me. But if you did go hiking for that long, then how many miles would you have walked? Assuming you're still alive, that is. Mark didn't think Mrs. Leghorn was very excited about going to the woods. In gym class, Mr. Harris had turned half of the general purpose room into an obstacle course. The course involved a lot of ducking under things, a lot of climbing over things, and some careful walking across the low balance beam without falling into the fake water. He had also built a small hill out of 15 or 20 tumbling mats and the pommel horse. Even the music teacher put preparations for the 5th grade spring concert on hold so everyone could learn some campfire songs. The whole 5th grade was moving toward the same goal, and of course Mr. Maxwell was leading the charge. When science class began on Monday afternoon, Mr. Maxwell smiled broadly and said, "This time next week we'll all be 75 miles away from here, breathing in some cool mountain air. So let's talk a little bit about air quality, shall we? First of all, what is air made up of?" A girl named Chelsea raised her hand, and Mr. Maxwell nodded at her. She said, "Oxygen and nitrogen?" Mr. Maxwell nodded. "Yep. Anything else? Anyone?" No other hands went up. Mark knew something about this because he'd done a science fair project in 3rd grade about air pollution, so he raised his hand. His was the only hand in the air. Mr. Maxwell looked around the room. It was impossible to miss Mark's hand. "Anyone?" Mr. Maxwell asked again. "No? Well, air is actually made up of a number of gases, and oxygen and nitrogen are 2 of them, just as Chelsea said." Mark brought his hand down, and he felt his face start to get warm. He felt like he'd been smacked on the cheek. He wouldn't have been able to put into words very well, but Mark knew what was going on. He knew what this thing with Mr. Maxwell was about, and Mark felt like it was pretty much his own fault. He knew he had been unpleasant and rude to Mr. Maxwell during his first couple of weeks. Mark knew he had offended the man, especially by not getting excited about the big trip. But Mark also knew that for his part, he'd let all that go, all of it. He wanted to be part of the class now. He wanted in, and he thought been sending clear signals to Mr. Maxwell, friendly signals. For a while, Mark had thought that the science teacher wasn't getting the message, and then for a couple of weeks, Mark had felt that maybe Mr. Maxwell had a right to ignore him, to keep him out in the cold, test him to be sure he was sincere. But today, Mark felt hurt and embarrassed. Today, he got the point, and the point was that Mr. Maxwell was punishing him. Mark wanted in, and Mr. Maxwell knew it, but he had just slammed the door in Mark's face. To his credit, Mark didn't get angry. He didn't tune out the class and stare at the floor or look out the window. Instead, he swallowed hard and tried to keep listening. He didn't let himself brood about the way Mr. Maxwell was treating him. He kept his mind focused on what the teacher was saying, because Mark truly wanted to learn about the woods and the mountains and the air and the weather, all of it. And whatever else he was, Mark had to admit that Mr. Maxwell was an expert. He just wasn't a very nice expert. When Mark got home from school Tuesday, there were 4 large cardboard boxes from REI waiting for him in the garage. Leon helped him unpack everything, whistling softly now and then in appreciation, sometimes asking Mark to explain a piece of equipment. "Very fancy," he said as Mark unrolled the bright orange sleeping bag to get a better look at it. "When I was a boy, I had an iron frying pan, a blanket roll tied with a piece of rope, a penknife, and a small axe. That was camping." Mark tucked the smaller gear like the magnesium block and the iodine drops and the flashlights right into the outer pockets on his new frame pack. He stuffed the sleeping bag inside the pack to give it some shape and weight, and then Leon helped him to move and adjust the shoulder straps so that it fit on his back correctly. Standing there with the straps fastened and the buckles clipped, Mark imagined himself at summer camp, all set for a 10-day hike. It made him feel strong and independent. And at that moment, Anya called from the kitchen door. "Both of you, come inside now. Mark, change your clothes and eat before you play with your new toys. Come." Later on, Mark took his new compass out into the woods. He sat on a fallen tree and read the instruction booklet from beginning to end. Then he did some of the recommending training exercises. He learned how to sight on a distant object, and he learned to count his steps so he could estimate how far he'd traveled in one direction. He didn't have a map to test it on, but he understood how to put the clear plastic base of the compass onto a map and then turn the map to line it up and get a true idea about the lay of the land. Then Mark laid out a simple course for himself, a big triangle, first east, then northwest, then southeast. With his eyes glued to the red and black needle of the compass, Mark paced off his course. 30 minutes later, he ended up back within 50 feet of his starting point. Mark felt like he'd just sailed around the globe. After dinner, Mark carried all his new equipment up to his room. He laid it out on the floor and on his bed. Then he got his Week in the Woods packet and found the packing list. Item by item, Mark laid out what he needed to take. Then he refolded all his clothes. Carefully, he laid his belongings into his new pack. It all fit in easily, even his hiking boots. Mark took another look at the packing list, and in the section about what not to bring, he saw no knives of any kind. So he dug into the outside pocket of his backpack, found his new knife, and walked across the room and dropped it into his desk drawer. The list also said no matches or lighters, but it didn't say no magnesium striker blocks, so Mark felt that in his left that in his backpack pocket. Then Mark sat at his desk and made a list of things he still needed, especially things that Mr. Survival said he ought to have. He still needed a space blanket, a piece of hacksaw blade, 2 zip seal plastic bags, some candy bars, a whistle, Band-Aids, some duct tape, some extra batteries, a magnifying glass, and some dental floss, and a heavy-duty sewing needle. The things we couldn't find around the house he'd get at Walmart, and Leon could take him there after school tomorrow, or the next day. Mark pushed his new sleeping bag into its stuff sack, a waterproof nylon bag with a drawstring at the open end. There were special straps on the top of his frame pack, and after a little fiddling, Mark got his bag fastened into position. Then came the moment of truth. Mark took hold of the pack and swung it around and up onto his back. He slipped the shoulder bands into place, fastened the chest strap, settled the waist belt onto his hips, and then pulled it tight and snapped the buckle. Taking a few strides around his room, he tested the weight. Felt like about 25 pounds. Not too bad. Very doable. And again, Mark had that feeling of strength and independence. Still, he had to admit it felt good when he took the pack off his back. But he knew he'd have plenty of time before summer to get used to hauling it around. He would start tomorrow. He'd wear the pack when he went out walking after school. Before long, he'd hardly notice it. He could even add a tent. The little ones were only about 5 or 6 more pounds. By summertime, he'd be ready to take the long hiking trip with the big guys at camp. Of course, for next week, his frame pack would just be like a medium-sized suitcase. Just an easy way to carry stuff to his cabin at the state park. Then Mark had a satisfying thought. When Mr. Maxwell saw him show up with all his gear, maybe the guy would know he wasn't looking at some little dork. Mr. Maxwell would see he was dealing with a kid who knew a thing or two about being outdoors. There was another thought, a thought that Mark didn't even put into words. It was more like a hope that he kept hidden from himself. Because Mark hoped that when Mr. Maxwell saw him so pulled together, so serious, so well prepared, then the man would ease up, cut him some slack. He hoped the man would show him some respect, because Mark knew he deserved that. Chapter 14, Zero Tolerance. As the black Mercedes pulled into the school driveway at 7 o'clock on Monday morning, Mark wished that he'd gotten up earlier, or maybe Leon should have driven faster, because tons of other fifth graders were already at the school. 3 big yellow buses sat at the curb, their doors open wide. Parked behind the buses, there were 5 pickup trucks and 4 minivans. The cargo beds of the first 2 pickups were already loaded with luggage. Mark saw a tall, rough-looking man talking with the principal. He had a clipboard, and so did Mrs. Gibson. She was pointing at the first bus, and the man was pointing at the second one. With a start, Mark realized what he was seeing. That tall guy, that's Mr. Maxwell. He was wearing dark brown trousers, tan lace-up hunting boots, a red flannel shirt, and a dark green jacket. His blaze orange cap was pulled down over a wild mess of green-brown hair, and it was plain to see that Mr. Maxwell had not shaved all weekend. He was headed for the woods. A group of other cars pulled up behind them, and Leon said, "Out you go now. You have a good time, Mark. Or how about you drive home and I'll go to the state park, eh?" Mark grinned. "Sometime we'll go together, okay? And do some real camping. See you, Leon." Leon popped the trunk open, and Mark jumped out. He grabbed his pack and slung it onto his back. It was about 3 pounds heavier than it had been when he had tried it out in his room that first night. The extra weight wasn't because of the last few items from Mr. Survival's list. The space blanket, the extra flashlight batteries, and the other items weighed almost nothing. He'd found a couple of other neat things at Walmart, too, like the saw that was just a piece of rough wire with a ring on each end, and the plastic emergency poncho. But that stuff was real light, too. The extra weight in his pack came from the school materials he was required to bring along. By the time Mark got onto the sidewalk, about 10 other kids were in line ahead of him, waiting to be checked in by Mr. Maxwell. Mark was surprised to see that 2 of the boys and one of the girls in line had frame packs, too. He suddenly wished he'd just thrown his stuff into an old suitcase. Compared to the packs these kids had, his looked brand new, because it was, and his was also a lot fancier. The fact that his pack was bright yellow didn't help, and the 1 liter water bottles he had tucked into the mesh pockets on either side of his pack seemed silly now, unnecessary, like he was showing off or something. When it was his turn, Mr. Maxwell glanced at him, then ran a quick eye over his gear and said, "Toss that into the fourth pickup and then get onto the first bus." That was it. No greeting, no comment, no smile. On the bus, Mark was glad to see Jason Fraser sitting near the back. He waved at Mark and then pointed at the seat across the aisle from him. As Mark sat down, Jason said, "Did you check out Old Man of the Mountain, Maxwell?" Mark nodded. "Yeah, I didn't even recognize him. Takes this whole deal pretty serious, said Jason. "Sort of too much, maybe, but who cares? No school, man. That's what I like. And my brother said that the food's good, too. Not like the stuff at our cafeteria." When the bus was almost full, Mrs. Stearns and Mrs. Leghorn got on. Mrs. Stearns smiled and joked with a group of girls sitting near the front of the bus. She had on hiking boots, jeans, and a hooded sweatshirt. She was in a good mood, and she was ready for the woods. Mrs. Leghorn was wearing a pair of bright white tennis shoes, some pale purple slacks, and a long red wool coat with wide sleeves. A large black purse was looped over one arm, and in her other hand she kept a tight grip on a tall stainless steel coffee mug. She stood stiffly, flinching every time a kid yelled or laughed too loudly. Mrs. Stearns called off the names from the list on her clipboard. 2 kids hadn't arrived, but by the time she'd read off all the names, they had slipped aboard. The bus driver climbed on, buckled her seatbelt, yanked on the door lever, and as soon as Mrs. Stearns and Mrs. Leghorn took their seats, the bus lurched forward. A week in the woods had officially begun.